A serious rival to Michelangelo was a 26-year-old upstart named Raphael. He had burst upon the scene and was chosen in 1508 to paint a fresco in Pope Julius II's private library, a commission vied for by both Michelangelo and Leonardo. When Leonardo's health began to fail him, Raphael assumed the role of Michelangelo's greatest rival. Because of Raphael's acuity in depicting anatomy and his finesse for painting nudes, Michelangelo would accuse him of copying his own work. Although acknowledging a degree of debt to Michelangelo, Raphael resented such animosity toward him and responded by painting the artist with his sulking face in the guise of Heraclitus in his famous fresco The School of Athens, 1509-11. Once the Sistine ceiling was completed, Michelangelo returned to work on the earlier project for the tomb of Pope Julius. Between 1513 to 15, he carved Moses, in which many recognize a new level of detail and control in his work that can be traced back to the figures of the prophets he painted on the Sistine ceiling. He also carved 2 further figures, thought to be slaves or prisoners. These pieces were also intended for the Julius tomb project, but they remained in the artist's possession until old age, when he gifted them to a family who had nursed him through an earlier bout of illness. They are now housed in the Louvre. Tomb of Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to create this architectural ensemble in 1505, but the work was not completed until 1545, and the finished piece was on a much reduced scale. Originally intended for St. Peter's Basilica, the tomb was instead placed in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli on the Esquiline in Rome, following the Pope's death. The initial designs were for a colossal structure that would have given Michelangelo the room he needed for his superhuman designs. The project was to become one of the great disappointments of the sculptor's life when the Pope, for unexplained reasons, interrupted the commission, possibly because funds had to be diverted for Bramante's rebuilding of St. Peter's. The original project called for a freestanding 3-level structure with over 40 statues. However, in April 1532, a final contract specified a simple wall tomb with less than 1/3 of the figures originally planned. The most famous sculpture associated with the tomb is the figure of Moses, which Michelangelo felt was his most lifelike creation. Legend has it that upon its completion he struck the right knee, commanding, "Now speak," believing that life was the only thing lacking inside the marble. There is a scar on the knee thought to be the mark of a Michelangelo hammer. To the left and right of Moses on the lower level are statues of the biblical characters Leah and Rachel, which were probably both completed by Michelangelo assistants, while several other sculptures, definitely not by Michelangelo, adorn the upper level of the tomb. Michelangelo, famous statues of the dying slave and the rebellious slave were also originally intended for this tomb, but were not included in the monument in its last and reduced design, and are now housed in the Louvre. Another prominent sculpture intended for Pope Julius's tomb was the Genius of Victory, now found in Florence's Palazzo Vecchio. Rebellious slave. On permanent display in the Louvre, this sculpture of a slave was originally intended for the second version of the tomb of Pope Julius II, commissioned by the Pope's heirs, the Della Rovere, in May 1513. Although the initial plans for a gigantic mausoleum were set aside, the work was still monumental, with a corridor richly decorated with sculptures, and Michelangelo was immediately placed in charge of the work. Among the first pieces completed were the two prigioni, renamed the slaves only in the 19th century, destined for the lower part of the funerary monument, next to the pilasters that framed the niches containing the victories. Their poses were determined by the needs of this architectural setting, so from the front their view was important, while from the side the views received less care than usual. All the prigioni produced in the studio of the artist were eliminated from the monument in its final version when completed in 1542. In 1546, Michelangelo gave the two works in the Louvre to Roberto Strozzi in return for his generous hospitality in his Roman house, following Michelangelo periods of sickness in July 1544 and June 1546. When Strozzi was exiled to Lyon in April 1550 for his opposition to Cosimo de' Medici, he had the two statues sent ahead. In April 1578, they were put on view in two niches in the courtyard of the castle of the Constable of Montmorency at Écouen, near Paris. In 1632, they were sold by Henri II de Montmorency to Cardinal Richelieu. In 1749, the Duke of Richelieu had them taken to Paris and placed in the Pavillon de Hanovre. They were hidden in 1793, but when the widow of the last Marshal of Richelieu attempted to put them on sale, they became the property of the government and joined the collection that is now in the Louvre. The rebellious slave is represented as trying to free himself from the fetters that constrain his hands behind his back, contorting his torso while twisting his head. The sculpture creates the impression of adding a sense of space to the monument, as though the figure is moving towards the viewer, with his raised shoulder and knee. The iconographic significance of the two figures is probably linked to the motif of the captive found from many examples of sculptures in Roman art. For some critics, the rebellious slave represents the trapped sculpture waiting to be set free from the marble. The Dying Slave, one of the Louvre's most celebrated sculptures. The Dying Slave was produced by Michelangelo between 1513 and 1516 and was intended to serve alongside the rebellious slave in the tomb of Pope Julius II. It is a particularly ambiguous sculpture that seems to capture not only the moment of death, but also a moment of extreme bliss or rapture, as the expression on the slave's face could be interpreted as one of pleasure, not pain. The posture and sensual arrangement of limbs also give the piece an erotic charge. The sculpture is given a further mysterious quality by the addition of a roughly hewn ape, which projects from the back of the slave's leg, merging from the supporting branch. Various suggestions have been made over the years as to the artist's intended meaning for this inclusion. Some point out that the ape represents ugliness, whilst the slave is its opposite form, pure beauty. Others identify how the ape is Michelangelo tongue-in-cheek reference to the simplicity of art and representation compared to the reality of the represented forms. Art is merely the aping of true reality. Other slave statues. These 4 sculptures of slaves date from circa 1530 and are all housed in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. Left unfinished, they formed part of the series of prigioni intended for the tomb of Julius II. crouching boy, located today in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, this 54 cm marble sculpture represents a naked boy with knees tucked up to his chest as he appears to be pulling a thorn from his foot. The statue is unfinished, although facial features, hair and body shapes are easily recognizable. The Genius of Victory, completed by 1534, this marble sculpture was also intended as part of the design for the tomb of Pope Julius II, most likely for one of the lower niches. The sculpture was left unfinished in Michelangelo's studio after his final departure from Florence in 1534 and became the property of his nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti, who tried to sell it in 1544. Without obtaining the necessary authorization from his uncle. Then in 1564, at the suggestion of Daniele da Volterra, the nephew tried to place the sculpture on Michelangelo's tomb in Santa Croce. But Giorgio Vasari, who was redesigning the church's interior, was against this proposal and suggested giving the statue to Duke Cosimo IV de' Medici. There the Genius of Victory came to decorate the Salone dei Cinquecento of the Palazzo Vecchio and was placed along the wall, among the statues of the Labors of Hercules by Vincenzo de' Rossi and others. The sculpture does not represent a moment of fighting, but rather serves as an allegory of victory, depicting a winner that dominates a submissive loser. The figure appears with agility, with one leg that blocks the body of the captive, who is folded and chained. The young man is portrayed as beautiful and elegant, while the dominated man is represented as old and bearded, with a flabby body and a resigned expression. The surfaces are treated expressively to enhance the contrast between the two figures. The young man is polished faultlessly, whilst the conquered figure's texture is rough and incomplete, still retaining the impression of the heavy stone from which it was fashioned. Following Pope Julius II's death in 1513, funds for his tomb were cut, and Michelangelo was commissioned by the new Pope Leo X to work on the facade of the Basilica San Lorenzo, the largest church in Florence, and therefore dedicated to the legacy of the Medici clan rather than the papacy. Michelangelo spent the next 3 years working on it before the project was cancelled due to lack of funds. Florence was under the rule of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, Pope Leo X's cousin, and the two men formed a close working relationship. Indeed, Michelangelo enjoyed great creative liberties under the cardinal, and this allowed him to move further into the field of architectural design. A project for a parish church in San Lorenzo was never realized, but Michelangelo did work on a design for the Medici Chapel. Cristo della Minerva, also known as Christ the Redeemer and Christ carrying the cross. This sculpture was completed in 1521 and is housed in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Commissioned in June 1514 by the Roman patrician Metello Vari, who stipulated only that the nude standing figure would have the cross in his arms, the rest of the composition was left entirely to Michelangelo. The sculptor had to give up the first version he was working on in his shop in 1515 when he discovered a black vein in the marble. A new version was hurriedly substituted in 1519 to fulfill the terms of the contract. Michelangelo worked on the piece in Florence before transporting it to Rome, where the final touches were entrusted to an apprentice, Pietro Urbano. However, Urbano damaged the work, and the apprentice had to be quickly replaced with Federico Frizzi, after a suggestion from Sebastiano del Piombo. Metello Vari asked for the first rough version of the sculpture, and it was given to him in January 1522 for the little garden courtyard of his palazzetto near Santa Maria sopra Minerva. The work then became lost for several centuries, until in 2000 Irene Baldriga recognized the first version, having been extensively reworked in the 17th century in the sacristy of the church of San Vincenzo Martire at Bassano Romano near Viterbo. Baldriga identified the black vein clearly distinguishable on Christ's left cheek of the sculpture. The second and official version was celebrated as an impressive achievement by Michelangelo contemporaries. Sebastiano del Piombo, a renowned artist of the Venetian school, humorously declared that the knees alone were worthy of more than the whole of Rome. Christ is represented by Michelangelo unclothed in a standing pose, while the genitalia are exposed in order to show that his sexuality is uncorrupted by lust and controlled by his will. In the ensuing Baroque period, a girdle was added due to changing tastes in art. In the figure's posture, a leg is flexed and the head turned back, according to the principle of contrapposto. Michelangelo worked on the new sacristy, complementing the old sacristy by Brunelleschi that sat on the opposite side of the church between 1520 and 1534. In its own literature, the Medici Chapels describes how Michelangelo worked on the sculptures of the sarcophagi, but the only ones actually completed were the statues of the Dukes Lorenzo and Giuliano, the allegories of dawn and dusk, night and day, and the group of Madonna and Child placed above the sarcophagus of the two Magnifici and flanked by Saints Cosmas and Damian. The latter were executed by Montosoli and Baccio di Montelupo, pupils of Michelangelo. The tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, although never finished, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici in the Medici Chapel of San Lorenzo in Florence, is the only one of Michelangelo's great architectural sculptural projects to come closest to completion. Built between 1520 and 1534, it is widely regarded as being one of Michelangelo's most stunning achievements in sculpting. The central figure on the tomb is Giuliano de' Medici, the third son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who stands with his arms resting by his sides and his legs comfortably apart. His posture and expression suggest a cheerful duke, generous in both mind and spirit. He holds in his hand several coins as an intended gift, signifying his generosity to the poor and his status as a patron to artists. Giuliano de' Medici is presented with the allegorical figures of night and day on either side of him. The most celebrated sculpture in the tomb, Night is clearly identified by an owl, a mask, and a clutch of poppies. A moon is represented on her diadem, and her muscular body demonstrates Michelangelo's habit of working from a male model, even for his female nudes. The figure of Night ranks for many as one of Michelangelo's finest works. In his entry, The Life of Michelangelo, in the Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, 1550, Giorgio Vasari quotes an epigram by Giovanni Strozzi, who said of the figure, Night, whom you see sleeping in such sweet attitudes, was carved in this stone by an angel, and although she sleeps, she has life. Wake her if you don't believe it, and she will speak to you. Tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici. Michelangelo started work on this tomb in the Medici Chapel simultaneously with the resuming of the works at the new sacristy of Florence during 1524, after Clement VII's election to the papal throne. Working on the tomb at the same time as the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, Michelangelo produced a statue of Lorenzo de' Medici with allegorical figures of dusk and dawn, reclining on each side of the Duke. However, work on the tomb was interrupted during the siege of Florence and not resumed until 1531. The two tombs, though similar in overall composition, present subtle contrasts and comment on the public image of each man. Whereas Giuliano is presented in an extroverted manner, Michelangelo portrays Lorenzo receding into the shadows, his body closed, his legs crossed and his mind deep in thought, deserving of his sobriquet il pensieroso, the thoughtful one. Dusk is given a haunting expression with unfinished surface for his face, strangely at odds with the highly polished finish of the rest of his body. Seen through a veil of marble, his pained expression evokes a surreal quality. The Laurentian Library, Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana, was built into a cloister of the Basilica of San Lorenzo. The library contains manuscripts and early printed books donated by Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent. It was built under the patronage of Pope Clement VII, who commissioned Michelangelo to design the architecture in 1524. Although often overlooked in surveys of his work, the stairwell, Ricetto, features Michelangelo original wall and floor decorations, while the columns in the library's main chamber are concealed behind the walls, rather than in front, as was typical of classical architectural design. allowing for the rows of desks to be placed in a rhythmic harmony with the windows. The library is considered an early example of the more decorative Mannerist style of high Renaissance art and architecture.